Thank you so much, Eric, for joining the We Don't Play podcast show today. How are you?
I'm great, Favor. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm great. This this topic is something I think a lot of people would love to tap into, especially if it's not their forte. It may be something they may want to dabble into and see. So I'm excited about this whole gaming industry. It's people talk about it every time, but we can never get away from gaming.
Absolutely. And gaming's part of life as well.
Exactly. They say the game of life. So I guess this is it. So tell us more about yourself, what you do, and how did you even get started? Like, what brought you to this point?
Well, first off, I am an artist, so both professionally and just on the side. So I'm a designer by trade, but a fine artist, and a comedian. I've done improv for about 11, 12 years at this point, and for most of my life, I've been a GM, or game master, and storyteller. And I got started gaming way back in the day when I was like 8 or 9 years old. And because I had appendicitis, and I was locked in my house for about a month. And couldn't go and run around and play. And someone got me the Dungeon Master's Guide back in the day. It was 2nd edition. And I started playing that. I started playing other role-playing games. And I've always been what I consider to be a storyteller in my mind, in my head, and making stuff up through play. And that translated over to my artistic career, obviously, because art is visual storytelling in many ways. But also with game mastering, playing Dungeons & Dragons is probably the one that most people recognize, but there's tons of games out there, Shadowrun, for example, or GURPS, White Wolf, and so forth. And through my friend Matt Staples, who also has gamed for about as long as I have, we decided to start a podcast to teach people how to game, how to tell better stories, play better characters, and basically have fun. And so that's where the Goblins Corner came about.
Okay. And why was it called the Goblins Corner? Because it's two words that catch my attention. Goblin and then corner.
So in D&D, goblins are kind of like the ubiquitous monsters in the game for low-level characters. And Matt and I have talked about our playing games for a long time. And a lot of times, those conversations would basically equate to us kind of sitting on the porch, BSing about, this rule or this storyline or something like that. Or maybe the books and novels that we've read that really inspire us. And so when we came up with the show, we decided to have this kind of mental image of these two goblins sitting in the corner with a beer talking about, the world. And so that's kind of how that came about.
Okay. I love that. And when you talked about being an artist, tell us a little bit more about that side, because we always hear artists are very subjective to their art, and sometimes when they go through some things and people tell them about their art, they're like, oh, thank you, or I didn't think you'd say that. So how important is feedback? I think that's the question. How important is feedback to you when people criticize or critique your art?
I would say feedback is very important. My trade is more in user experience design by day, but I'm also, again, a painter, so we can talk about that later. But in terms of UX design, I think feedback's especially important because designers tend to try to solve a problem. And I like to tell people, a designer is someone who is a problem solver that uses art as a toolkit, much like a carpenter would use a hammer and nail. Mm-hmm. And so feedback's important because if you're not doing what the user needs or what your client needs, then you aren't on track. That's where bad design comes from, because you're not listening. Art in general is a conversation between multiple different people, right? So you've got the end result. So the end user is oftentimes what people refer to that as. You have the client and their objectives, either to sign people up for a site or to generate more revenue. And then you have the business objectives overall. For example, maybe growth or defining some kind of need that allows the business to succeed. And so when you do a design, you want that feedback from either your peers, other designers, so that they can help you improve your craft, or maybe even your failures, right? From clients or otherwise. We learn best by falling and picking ourselves back up.
That is true. It's more like failing forward in a way, and we're always afraid of failing, but when it happens, we just take it and they're like, yeah, let's take our L and run. But
yeah,
at some point, you're like, yeah, go ahead. I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh no, my whole career has been falling forward in terms of stuff like that. In improv, they say follow the fear, and so in comedy, you want to seek out those things which scare you, which make you afraid, because yes, you're going to fail, and you're going to learn something by failing, and that is where we find ourselves become the most creative, when we're kind of backed in a corner and we don't know how to do something. And that's where all the novel approaches come from. So I'm a big fan of screwing something up and just learning from it.
I love that. I really love that. When you think about creative mindset, somebody wants to be creative. We're all creatives in our own way. But how do you make someone creative? Like, what's the best way to start thinking creatively? Is it by reading books or going to shows? Like, how can you get that zen out so that you can be your best self in that creative space?
Well, I think the best way to start being creative is just to observe the world around you. Find things that inspire you, and it really differs depending upon the person, right? So in comedy, I find watching people is a very fun exercise, because people are funny. People are, they're generous, they're eager, they're earnest, and they're hilarious. All of our faults, all of our successes generate comedy. In fine art, nature is a great thing to look at, and just the world around you. And yes, obviously, as a student of design, I would definitely say, if you want to get skills and such, work on acquiring design knowledge, reading the publications, learning your craft and stuff like that. But I think it all begins with finding something. It could be anything, maybe you happen to enjoy animals, and that might be the gateway by which you get into the greater world of design and art. It might be, I don't know, Lego models, right? I met this guy who was a designer. He made a whole bunch of pixel art, and the reason he got started is because he liked to build Legos as a kid. And I thought that was a really cool gateway into it. He just found something that was interesting. All of life stems around art anyway, and then find what you really jive with.
I love that. When you mentioned that, what came to my mind is, I don't know if you're into this, because a lot of artists are, or graphic artists are, but how does this play a role into NFTs and art? If you have any ideas on that, because I know not everybody's in it, but if that's something you could touch on, could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm not big on NFTs right now. I'm not real sure its value at the moment.
Okay.
There's a lot of people that say, hey, this is the next big thing in terms of currency and the value of art. One of the things about art has always existed is that art has always been subjective. It's always had a subjective value to it in terms of how much something is, but it's also had a subjective value in terms of what it means to somebody else. And I'll give two examples. Van Gogh never sold a painting. He died poor, and only 100 years after his death or more did any of his work become actually viable and worth something. Also, in terms of what people maybe might be what considered to be art. So, for example, some people oftentimes say Dadaism is a good example, where I believe it's Paul Duchamp who signed a toilet bowl and claimed that was art. I get the idea. May not be my personal thing, right? Because I was like, okay, that's art because it's art, right? Art is something that evokes an emotion, regardless of whether you like it or don't like it, right? If it makes you think, it's probably art. But that value to the individual may be vastly different across spectrums. And so where NFTs come into play, I think, is society is trying to define a net value for a particular art piece. And I think that how you see a lot of them having problems right now is that it's entirely subjective. And so when you're trying to lock down this piece of artwork is worth this much, well, you may find that that's going to vastly fluctuate. And so it doesn't really seem particularly viable right now because it's so fluid.
I like that you said that, because it's something that people are still trying to tap into, especially if you're making a financial commitment to it. It's not going to be like, oh yeah, NFTs, yeah, let me put $100,000 now. They'll be like, no, I don't know if this is going to the ether. You know, we've heard different stories, like, you know, what's happening in the financial world. So art is very big, and people love to go to museums. They love to go to art galleries, centers, and all those things. So playing that role is very important, and I'm glad that you brought that up today, because, you know, just wanted to have an idea of what your thoughts were.
Yeah, and art follows trends too.
Yeah.
So 20 years from now, that art piece might not be worth anything, or it might be worth 20 times its value. And that's one of those things. When you're trying to buy something that's an NFT, you're kind of taking a really big gamble. You're gambling that it's going to be worth more, or at least enough that you can offload it to somebody else before it spirals back down.
100%. You know, I'm glad you mentioned that, because, you know, I'm thinking about the gaming side of things too, because when people buy games, they buy games that have art on them. You know, there's their picture. So if someone wants to get Fortnite, they know what that looks like. You know, so how does that play into conversions, you know, connections, and just branding in general?
I would say good artwork emphasizes the story. It all comes down to a story, and you know this. The best games you've played have been ones with a great story behind them.
Yeah.
If they don't have a story, then it's just something fun. You might pick it up and put it down later, but the ones that really draw us in have a well-written story, lore behind it, maybe character development or something like that. And art plays into that because it either enhances the storyline or it assists with telling the story. This falls into play regardless of whether you're playing a video game or even, you know, my area of expertise, you know, tabletop gaming, right? Some of the best artwork from many of the books that you read. So I'll take Dragonlance as an example, right? The artist behind the Dragonlance series, the original books, the artwork was very well done, and people literally would just buy the book because of the artwork behind it. And then they got into the story, so that assisted with that. I would definitely say if you're an author, go find yourself a good artist to help you sell that book.
That is true. We can't ignore art. It's everywhere, in music, in fashion, it's everywhere. So you can't ignore. And the world is also art, you know. So it's just a beautiful place to be in, and I really appreciate you for that too. You know, one of the things that you mentioned that caught my attention was a tabletop. Now, my audience may know what that is. Some people may be like, huh? So could you please tell us a little bit, what is tabletop gaming? And then give us an example like you did, but with more description, and then tell us what your favorite, you know, tabletop role-playing game is.
Okay. A tabletop game is a storytelling game that you play with a bunch of people. Usually it's centered around a particular storyteller. In Dungeons & Dragons, they call it a dungeon master, but it also could be storyteller or game master or whatever. Mm-hmm. And the idea behind it is that you're basically free-form improving with a character of some sort that you've developed, and their stats determine, for example, how smart they are, how strong they are, maybe some personality quirks, or you can even play different species, right? So like dragons and stuff like that. And whenever you do some sort of action, then you would roll dice to let randomness determine whether you succeed or fail. And depending upon how, for example, smart you are or strong you are, you either succeeded or failed depending upon those stats and those rolls. So it's very similar to when we were playing with our toys as kids. It's almost identical to that. The only difference is you've got a little bit of rules behind that. I'll give you an example. You and I are sitting in a bar and we're having a beer, and all of a sudden bursts in a troll, right? He's 8 foot tall, he's covered in warts, he's green skinned, he's got some big tusks, and he immediately just slugs the barkeep, knocks him out cold. What do? Right? So we're just two people hanging out. You might say, oh, I gotta save this barkeep, man. He just gave me a shot. And so you jump him, right? You jump on his back. Cool, that's an action. You get to roll for that. And then in the game, we would have made some stats up beforehand, and that's it. That's a tabletop game. There are many different types. Dungeons and Dragons is the one that most people recognize when they hear tabletop role-playing. But there's also card games, which can work very similar to that. So Munchkin's a good example, or Gloomhaven, which is written by Keith Baker. You could play futuristic games such as Travelers or Shadowrun. You could play any different type of game. There's anime games out there, all kinds of stories. And so the idea behind a tabletop game is really sitting with your friends, telling a story, collaboratively building the world, and then rolling some dice to see if you succeed or fail in your actions and having fun.
I love that. It's like you put a story in someone's mind and then you create that improv, and then there's also that role playing that comes into what you're doing. So, that also gets me to think about this, and I'm asking myself, okay, what is the secret to life, the universe, and everything? What are the things that you play into? Because, as you mentioned this, people play games to escape from reality in a way. So when you think about the universe, life in itself, how does this play a role into your actual well-being mentally?
It took a second for me to not do a Douglas Adams reference with life, the universe, and everything being 42. Aside from that, I would say, in terms of like playing into my life, the concept of play is part of everybody's nature. Mm-hmm. And this goes back to, again, we're talking once again about art and play. Gaming and tabletop storytelling is free because it allows you to explore worlds and concepts that don't exist in your day-to-day life. It helps, hone your mind. It helps you think on your feet. So if you can make up a story about, we talk about the troll slugging the barkeep, right? If you can make something like that off the cuff and plan a story out with a bunch of different people who have all different answers, then you can plan for any contingency in a business world or in your real life. For example, I ace interviews because because A, I'm an improviser, but also B, because I'm good at storytelling. And when you're you're going through a job interview and they ask you to tell them a story about something. Well, if you already play games and you know how to storytell, then you can involve that into your business aspect and nail that interview. If you're presenting something, then that allows you to speak publicly with more confidence and a greater emphasis on what you need to communicate. If you are just in your day-to-day life and stress gets you down, it's just like reading a book or watching a movie. It's a fun escape to get away from the stresses of life, because the act of creation, whether it's storytelling or gaming in general, is fun. It releases those good endorphins. It makes you feel better.
Yeah, that is true. Wow. I think that has given us a new perspective on how to treat life, because it's very fragile, and everybody is trying to make the most out of their lives by doing things differently. And if you've never been to a tabletop game, you may not know what that is until you try it. And then when you try it, you're like, oh, this is cool. Let me spend more hours on it. So I think this is something that a lot of people have to also get into the know-how, because some people don't even like games at all. They think it's just like a waste of time. But for others, it's like this is a place where you actually train your brain in a way to actually think through things and work through your neurons and everything. But what is your thought on this when it comes to gaming and also mindset when it comes to like exercising your brain muscles? Let me put it like that.
Excuse me. Well, there's a lot of different types of strategies behind telling a story. And so I'll give an example of this. When I first started running games, right? I'll go back to a D&D game I once ran when I was a kid.
Okay.
I would plan stuff out, and I had all the maps written, and they were going to go into this dungeon, and I had my friends over, and all the characters were ready, and then they didn't do anything that I planned. Like, they literally were like, oh, that's cool, we're going to go do something else. And I learned very early on to think on your feet. And so what I would say is, what gaming does to help your brain specifically is it teaches you to plan ahead, but then drop whatever comes your way.
Yeah.
So have a plan, but then improvise that plan and be adaptable. It teaches flexibility in your thinking process, and ironically directly translates over to improvising, which is why I kind of naturally went into improv comedy as well, because it's literally just telling a story and making stuff up as well. So I'd say if you're stuck in a rut and you maybe can't creatively generate some really good ideas or anything like that, play a tabletop game for a while. It'll expand your mind, and it'll help you creatively come up with different concepts, even inventions and stuff like that, right? So come up with different ideas for your real life.
I love that. And you brought in the comedy piece, which was going to be the last question I was going to ask you, which is so perfectly placed about improv comedy, because people think comedy, you have to like sit down, write scripts, laugh at your own joke to see if it's laughable and all those things. But I think because you're telling stories naturally, it's giving you that ability to expand your thinking, and that also gives somebody a way to tap into your thinking too. So for you to make someone laugh is a hard job, honestly, but if you can do it every time and you're literally tickling their funny bone, you're pretty much good to go.
And something to think about as well is that it's different from stand-up comedy in that stand-up is very similar to selling yourself, right?
Right.
I've got a product, I'm selling myself, here's the whole deal. Improv comedy is collaborative, just like tabletop game, right? It's not just me up on stage when I'm telling a story as an improviser. I've got my cast behind me as well, unless it's like a mono scene. And so I get to explore their brains and their ideas while I'm up on stage, just like I get to explore my players' brains and ideas when I'm running a game. There's this thing about collaborative storytelling in general, and this can also include collaborative artwork, by the way. Some of my best pieces that I've done in my on the side have been collaborative artwork pieces. We focus a lot on the self in modern day world, right? You got to improve yourself. You got to rise above everybody else, step on people and stuff like that. And that's kind of a bad way to look at it. Let's go back and look at how kids deal with the world. They play together, they collaboratively build their world, right? I have 2 kids, so if you ever watch kids go meet other kids, they'll start sharing their toys and building little worlds and stuff like that together once they get used to each other. And humans were designed to be social and collaborative. And so that's why some of the best art and the most creative concepts we come up with have always been collaborative storytelling. Why else do business people get into a meeting room with a whiteboard and sit there and collaboratively come up with ideas? It's because it works. Yeah. And so if you get that piece out of anything else, then you realize that if you want to get better at anything, engage another person, communicate with people of like mind or even different minds, and build something together collaboratively, and you will succeed every time.
So true. So true. Wow. That's a beautiful picture to paint, honestly, because it boils down to like your own thinking, because like you said earlier, being creative, it has to do with you. And if you can't be your own creation or create something that's within you, then somebody can apply or complement or even collaborate with you, because you have a wall, like you're stuck up. But with this creative juices flowing right from birth, it's like you just have to know where to tap into and give the right source to the person so they can give something back to you that's tangible. So I love how you were able to bring that up. If there's one thing that you would leave with the podcast show today and the audience, what would that be? What would be that major key takeaway that they would want to have, after listening to this show?
In regards to the podcast, I would say, actually in life, I would leave with, learn to have fun again. Too often we're very serious in the world, and all of my success has been a delightful, whimsical journey because I've learned to have fun with everything I do and have fun with the people that I'm working with, whether it's professionally or socially. And I think one of the things our podcast does best is to teach you how to collaboratively play with other people again. Go back to being that kid. And I think that you will, if you learn how to do that, you will be not only more successful, but also just happier overall in your life, because you're not so focused on an objective. The objective means nothing. It's the journey with other people that makes it worthwhile.
That is so true. Thank you so much for bringing this light to the show, to the episode, to the podcast. I really appreciate you, Eric, for being here. And I know some people may want to connect with you and also learn about, what you do. How else can they be able to reach out to you if they have any questions, or maybe they want to do an improv comedy with you someday? What are the options they have available?
Oh, I would love that. You can hit us up at Goblin's Corner on Twitter. You can also find all of our podcasts and YouTube shows on goblinscorner.com. And of course, we have a YouTube channel, and we're on all of the audio players as well. Feel free to hit me up if you want to email me, info@goblinscorner.com. We're happy to talk to anybody.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And that will also be available in the show notes for people, so they can just click on it and act upon it. So I really appreciate you for being here, Eric. And I wish you a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day and also rest of your week too.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate being on the show.
You're welcome. Anytime.